Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the National Coalition on School Diversity's virtual keynote discussion. Sorry we're a few minutes late. My name is Gina Chirchino, and I currently serve as the NCSD's director. I noticed a lot of new names during the registration process, which was awesome. We wanted to provide a little bit of feedback to folks on the coalition, to folks who are new to us, to help with the dialogue you're about to hear in context. As the main hub of the school integration movement, NCSD provides a space for parents, students, educators, researchers, advocates, activists, policymakers, and other supporters to coalesce around a shared commitment to racially and socioeconomically integrated education. Our work is guided by a belief that school diversity is the cornerstone to building an inclusive, civically engaged, and equitable society. NCSD's approach recognizes that it takes all kinds of people working together to disrupt the structures that create inequity and marginalize children and communities. The NCSD started in 2009 as a result of advocacy leading up to and following a legal challenge to race-conscious student assignment plans in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Two key insights led to the coalition's development. First, that many organizations shared a commitment to racially and socioeconomically integrated schools. However, it was very rarely among their top priorities when meeting with policymakers at the Department of Education or in Congress. Thus, the school integration had been lost as a conversation within the policy world. Second, people recognized that the evidence base supporting school integration had grown stronger over time, but it was not being used to guide decision-making. So we launched in 2009 with 9 organizations, and now entering our 11th year, we have over 50 members. We exist to ensure that people advocating for school integration receive the support that they need to do this important and difficult work. As you probably know, this dialogue was originally scheduled to take place at our national conference in March. Had we been able to gather in person, our audience would have already heard from leaders across the movement about the state of integration in their respective communities and gotten an overview of school integration policy issues currently in play. Students from Integrate NYC would have had the opportunity to share with you their framework for integration, known as the 5 R's of real integration. I'll get back to this in a second, but there's a slide up right now so you can get a preview of it. This keynote would have been followed by a series of workshops and collaborative work sessions to help us tackle some of the most pressing needs and challenges within the movement. And of course, you would have been served cupcakes and Prosecco at the end of the day, my signature conference offering. Although none of this is able to happen here today, I wanted to note 2 things. One, that we've compiled a set of resources to help provide some of that important background information for you on our website. And second, that we plan on continuing to host online sessions to ensure that what we had planned for you is able to reach you. And when appropriate, we will gather in person. Today's conversation, though, is about stepping back to take stock of what is happening around us and collectively envision our future direction as a movement. The anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education gives us all an opportunity to do this every year. And I hope that we can be more intentional about taking the time to do it together. May 17th also happened to be the birthday of Courtney McKitton, who was a member of NCSD's steering committee and the founder and executive director of Integrated Schools. Courtney was struck and killed by a car in December 2019. I miss her every day, often in moments when I find myself seeking to emulate her grace, fortitude, humor, and sense of accountability. Today's discussion was planned with her in mind. If I had to describe the keynote in 2 words, they would be pause and reflect. Before I turn it over to Courtney Martin to share some additional remarks about Courtney McKitton and to introduce our facilitator, I wanted to acknowledge that this conversation is deeply rooted in the 5 R's of real integration, which I mentioned earlier. Created by students in New York City, the 5R framework helps us think about school integration in a more holistic way. Real integration, as defined by the 5 R's, includes race and enrollment, resource allocation, relationships across group identities, restorative justice, and representation. Those familiar with the legal landscape will recognize that the 5 R's very closely mirror what are known as the green factors in desegregation law. During this conversation, we'll be asked to think about the connections between desegregation, both as it was envisioned and how it was implemented, in relation to educator diversity, curriculum, and pedagogy. We encourage you to share your insights and perspectives with us and one another. There are a few ways that you can do that. Andrew, if you want to, yep. You can share comments and ask questions on both YouTube and Facebook. Anything you write in the comment box will be visible to people on that platform, and it will also be sent to the event moderator. If you want to interact with one another or share reflections with a wider audience, we are using the hashtag NCSD2020 on Twitter. We chose this event platform because it allows us to be a bit more interactive and responsive, so we hope you'll be able to take advantage of that. Last, I just wanted to note that working with this group has been a huge bright spot in the midst of the current reality. When we finally accepted that we needed to cancel the in-person gathering, I knew that I didn't want to lose the opportunity to have this conversation and believe that our movement should be leading it. I was relieved when the panelists not only agreed, but fiercely supported the idea to move forward. Thank you to each of you, Vanessa, Elizabeth, Dani, and Courtney. And thank you, Andrew Lefkowits of Integrated Schools, for all of your technical and moral support. So you've heard enough from me, and I want to thank you again for joining us, but now it's time to turn it over to Courtney. Take care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Gina. And I also want to express my gratitude to this group and to Andrew. I just really want to have everyone take one pause. This whole, speaking through the interwebs thing is so strange. And I had to sort of slow myself down this morning as I transitioned from childcare to this, to bring Courtney to me, Courtney McKitten, who I'm going to talk about kind of physically and spiritually. And so I thought I would just take 1 minute for everyone to take a deep breath. And those who knew her, to bring her to mind, bring her to heart. Those who did not, please listen to my words and try to conjure her up, because she is worth conjuring. So here's what I wanted to share. Eula Biss, in her essay White Debt in the New York Times Magazine, writes, "Being white is easy in that nobody is expected to think about being white, but this is exactly what makes me uneasy about it. Without thinking, I would say that believing I am white doesn't cost me anything, that it's pure profit. But I suspect that isn't true. I suspect whiteness is costing me, as Baldwin would say, my moral life. This cost had been creeping up on me over the years, but I never felt it so acutely until I was trying to understand preschool and then the kindergarten process for my now 6-year-old daughter. I was on these tours in Oakland, California, where I live, and all these white and Asian American parents were asking what seemed like bizarrely specific questions to me. But none of them were asking the question that was starting to form in my mind. Where are all the Black and Latinx parents? We live in Oakland. What is going on here? The person who helped me first start pursuing quality answers, structural answers to those questions was Courtney Everts McKitten, a white mom in LA who founded an organization called Integrated Schools. I want you to know a bit about how she shaped me before her untimely death and the conversation I'm still having with her, and the conversation we're all going to have together today. An anthropologist by training, Courtney understood that the playground was political. No matter how much we might pretend otherwise, she encouraged white and privileged parents to work on their own mindset, countering what she called the smog of whiteness, which she described as all, this is a quote, all of the things that we hear and say about schools, often without realizing the ways those things are racialized. She also encouraged parents to expand their own knowledge about integration in this country. Who has had the burden historically? So much of what Vanessa and Elizabeth will talk about, and how effective it actually is when sustained over time. She inspired parents to be what Elizabeth calls constant gardeners, but this time around of desegregation, or if we're really working it, integration. Courtney encouraged us to practice talking about all of that, even when it felt uncomfortable, like while standing around at the 4-year-old birthday party eating gluten-free cupcakes. She didn't buy into what some white people might call polite company. There is no being polite, she believed, when our schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1960s, and the opportunity gap is still so dramatic. Courtney was a strategic organizer. She recognized that the time is now. Cities are growing and gentrifying, meaning for better and worse, more of us are living in racially diverse neighborhoods than in previous decades. Even white and privileged parents are growing disenchanted with intensive parenting, the religion, if you will, of seeking the best for your kids at all times, no matter what the collective cost. And finally, there's a growing public conversation about how we define a good school. More and more people recognize that test scores largely map onto socioeconomic backgrounds, giving a prospective parent little information about how the kids actually feel, learn, and come together as a community at a given school. Importantly, Courtney wasn't just urging white parents what to do, desegregate schools. She was urging them to think long and hard about how they did it. In short, show up and shut up, at least for a while. Create real relationships, proceed humbly, and with a sense of humor about yourself. Courtney knew from her own experience, her kids are now 15 and 17, that it was easy to get overzealous as a white privileged parent in a school where most people don't look like you, to step into leadership with a style that alienates others or takes on issues that aren't actually important to the majority. My white 6-year-old goes to a predominantly Black and brown school, a dreaded 1 out of 10 on the greatschools.org website. Courtney helped me have the courage and context to make that choice, despite the fact that neighbors warned me against doing so, and most of my friends didn't do the same. She showed me that people like me do things like this. Ever since I heard that she died, I heard on a playground no less, I've been having conversations with Courtney in my head, the most recent one about this bizarre moment we're all living through. I write her letters sometimes, as weird as that might sound, and shortly after sheltering in started, I wrote her this. Dear Courtney, part of me is glad you're not here to see this. It sort of feels like the end of the world. I'd want to spare anyone I love and admire of it. The daily death counts, the knowing that all these kids are being forced to stay in homes, many of which didn't feel safe in the first place, the palpable anxiety in the air. There's no escaping it, this dread. But there's also no escaping our mutuality, finally, and that's the part that I wish you could actually be here for. I think you would have recognized this moment for what it is, an opening in people's lived, felt experience, that damn, we actually are interdependent. There is no way to buy your way out of this virus or your own vulnerability on this planet right now. I guess the question is, do people take this profound confrontation with our undeniable mutuality and reimagine their values and lives? A big fucking ask. Or do they hunker down even further, figuring out how to homeschool their kids with the most sophisticated technology and rigid schedules, trap their au pairs so they don't lose their own work hours, and post on social media about brave healthcare workers? Probably more likely when you consider the history of white people and how we respond to crisis. I don't want to be cynical about it all. I want to believe that this might just be the earthquake of consciousness that white parents need to, among other things, stop underestimating the foundational value of the public school system. The letter goes on. The jury is still out on that, and Brown v. Board, as it turns out, which is what today is about. The fact that the story we tell about desegregation in this country is so surface level, it's laughable. Or it would be laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. The 3 women you are about to hear from are anything but surface. They are deep. They are excellent at their craft. They are carrying the real story of segregation's failures. If we listen hard enough, we will also hear a vision for a future, which I know is what we're all so hungry for right now. What Courtney didn't get, a future, but what the organization she so wisely and warmly created is still driving towards in her painful absence. Thank you, Courtney. Next up is a thinker and mother and activist I admire so much, someone I've actually known since we were both babies at Columbia University together. Dani McClain is a journalist who has written some of the decade's most important coverage of the reproductive justice movement, often for The Nation, where she is a contributing writer, among other publications. And just last year, she wrote a book called We Live for the We, about Black motherhood. It's gorgeous. She's visionary. Please welcome, straight out of Cincinnati, Ms. Dani McClain.
Courtney, thank you so much. I think we could have asked for a better start to this conversation. Thank you for grounding us in our hearts and helping those of us who didn't have the privilege of knowing Courtney better understand who she was and her legacy. And it's such an honor to be in this work with you. I'm thinking about us on that college campus together 20 years ago, and to be shoulder to shoulder with you now as we do this work on behalf of our own little ones. It's very meaningful. So thank you so much for your friendship and for your words today, and for the incredible work that you're doing around race and education. So 4 years ago, when I was pregnant with my first child, I set out to write a book that I hoped would help me answer questions that I had about raising a Black child in this country today. Many of those questions were related to how to think about educating my child from preschool, where we'd be focused primarily on socialization, to the kindergarten through 12th grade years, where we'd want strong academics, lasting and legitimate friendships, and teachers who could see and help draw out my child's full potential. I interviewed Black parents of school-age children, and I talked to educators and other experts. But I wish I had read Vanessa Siddle Walker's and Elizabeth McRae's books back then. If I had, I would have gotten some much needed context for what I observed as I looked into local educational options for my daughter. I would have better understood why, even when I found schools that had a fairly racially mixed student body, I was hard pressed to find even one Black teacher or Black administrator in the building. I would have better understood why here in Cincinnati, magnet elementary schools that were set up as part of the district's desegregation plan in the mid-70s are now less racially mixed than they were when I was growing up here in the 80s and 90s. And I would have better understood why, when I brought this up during school tours, white parents and educators would often skirt the issue and act as if I was the one creating a problem by mentioning race. I report on parenting and the politics surrounding reproductive health. And when I first started on the beat, I was introduced to the reproductive justice framework by organizers in that movement who explained to me that reproductive justice advances the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent the children that we do have in safe and healthy communities. In the realm of reproductive rights, as in education, the conversation often focuses on the first of these, what an individual has a right to do or not do. What I hope today's conversation can help us understand is that last piece of the reproductive justice framework, the right to parent the children that we have in safe and healthy communities, and how that relates to what we want for our schools. When we talk about race in education, how might we move from a focus on individual choice, liberty, freedom, toward an embrace of shared responsibility and commitment to community? Today, we get to think through these questions with two great scholars. With Mothers of Massive Resistance and The Lost Education of Horace Tate, we get a new type of history of the civil rights era. These authors move us away from the often told stories about elected officials or leaders of big national civil rights organizations and into homes and school buildings, the places where parents and teachers strategized and organized. Near the end of The Lost Education of Horace Tate, Dr. Siddle Walker writes, "Sometimes you have to look in the rearview mirror in order to see a current path better." I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to do that together today. Vanessa Siddle Walker I'm glad to be able to introduce Dr. Siddle Walker to you now. She's the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of African American and Educational Studies at Emory University. She has a BA from UNC and a master's and doctorate in education from Harvard. For 25 years, she has explored the segregated American children, considering sequentially the climate that permeated segregated schools, the network of professional collaborations that explains the similarity across schools, and the hidden systems of advocacy that demanded equality and justice for the children in the schools. Her most recent book, published as The Lost Education of Horace Tate, Uncovering the Hidden Heroes Who Fought for Justice in Schools, was the winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award for 2019 and lauded as one of the best nonfiction books by Publishers Weekly. Walker is president of the American Educational Research Association for 2019 to 2020, and she serves on the research advisory panel for the National Coalition on School Diversity. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Dani. The first thing I have to say is that I actually just finished my year as president of ARA, so I have passed that test.
Okay, great. Let's get, if we could just bring a Elizabeth to join us for a second, and then we'll get into our conversation. So Elizabeth Gillespie McRae is the Creighton Sossaman Professor of History at Western Carolina and the co-founder of the Appalachian Oral History Project. Her teaching and research interests center on the intersection of race, gender, and politics in America and in the modern South. She's published articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC's World Histories. Her book, Mothers of Massive Resistance, published in 2018, examines white women's work in maintaining white supremacy in public education, social welfare policy, politics, and culture. Her next project will examine the issue of school choice in American history. Thank you both for being with us today. My first question is for you, Vanessa. So who was Horace Tate, who we hear about in the title of your most recent book? And what does his story tell us about Black-led education in the South prior to 1954? I'm curious about the role of the Black educator, both in the school and the wider community, and how they worked in partnership with students and parents.
That's a mouthful question, Dani, but I'll try to answer it. So who's Horace Tate? He's the man that Martin Luther King stands on stage and says, "This is my friend, Horace Tate," and assumes that everybody should know about him. He says, for he's already been written in the annals of history. That's in 1967. But he's also the Black educator, the leader of a teachers organization that most people had never heard of. When I finished writing the earlier books on Black education, I was told by several people, you need to meet Horace Tate. But Horace Tate was a retired senator by that time, and I don't run around with senators, and I didn't really see why I needed to meet the head of the teachers organization. I mean, that sounded like, I don't know, an executive job. I mean, I was interested in real-time schools. And so it took me a while before I actually reached out to him. When I finally did, and we began to meet someplace he called the building, the old Black teachers building. And he would ask me what I knew about segregated schools. And I remember he would say, you've got part of the story. Yeah, part of the story. And then he would launch into his own stories, most of which made no sense to me, honestly, at the time, even though I was someone who was supposed to know a lot about segregated schools. I've come to understand that Horace Tate was the keeper of the story. There were Horace Tates in every Southern state, meaning that his work is not unique, but it is generalizable and it helps represent what was happening across the South. But he was the keeper of the story because Horace Tate hid the records. The attic of an old building as far away from prying white eyes as possible. He hid what was actually happening with Black schools and Black teachers, even down to the legal documents for the cases that would ultimately be litigated around school desegregation. So Horace Tate gives us a lens into an era that we could not otherwise have had. What is this story? You ask about the segregated schools. There's the part that I knew and I understood, right? When I first met Dr. Tate, when I'd written Our Highest Potential and Hello Professor, some other things. Part of what was going on is this notion of pedagogy in schools, right? Because these Black educators understood some things about pedagogy that actually we're still struggling with today. They understood, for example, the care ethic. I talk about it as institutional caring, interpersonal caring. They weren't interested in the psychic and cultural harm, right, that you talk about. But what we see is them actually creating policies that allow schools to become places where the negative messages that Black students get in the larger society are actually reconstructed within the school so that negative messages become positive messages about who you are and what you can achieve. Interestingly, in a time when it was full segregation, they were preparing these kids for a world that did not yet exist. And they did it through this institutional and interpersonal caring. They've got a curriculum going on in these schools. They're very clear that they want Black children to experience everything that white children had available. So they're very intentional about trying to get these textbooks and school buildings and everything that white people have. And in fact, in the 1960s, you sometimes see them have classes in Black schools that were not even held in white schools. So they want to make sure that Black children have what they needed based on the state curriculum. But for them, pedagogy is beyond just what whites were doing. but then pedagogy is also a revolutionary act. So, for example, the civics curriculum, right? When whites are starting to talk about, as Elizabeth will talk about, I'm sure later, how when Rutherford is saying we have to have civics education to train white children in how to be good Confederate, believers in the Confederacy, Black educators in the same year, 1919, are beginning to talk about we need to figure out civics education for Black children. And so on one hand, they began a push towards textbooks, and we'll see this over time because they want Black people written into textbooks. But we also see a completely different kind of civics plan that happens in these schools. So they're saying we need to teach these kids about democracy and about how America is supposed to work. Their belief was that if we teach the children how America is supposed to work, then they will know, as one of them later said, that somebody did something to them, right? And that the America they were living is not the America that they were actually, what they were living was not what America says it was. And so they have this very sophisticated civics curriculum going on at the same time that they create an English curriculum that has poetry, a history curriculum that has Blacks built into it. And so you see them with the resilience. So we're teaching children to be resilient in this space. If you combine the two, an understanding of what's being done to you with the courage to step out against it, then what you're really doing is laying the foundation for what we'll later see as the civil rights movement. The Atlanta Daily World captures this in 1938 when they say, if they keep doing this at Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, another generation is not going to sit down. They're going to stand up and demand their rights. And of course, we see that that's what can happen. A couple of other really quick points: parental involvement. They understood. They understood how to help parents advocate. They understood how to work with organizations and get larger money. They understood professionalism. Black teachers didn't know they weren't professionals until they integrated and white teachers told them they weren't. Those things are all part of Horace Tate's lost education. But Horace Tate also shows us what it meant to advocate for the children, what it meant to have a vision for desegregation. We'll talk about those pieces later. So there's this whole generational, from Reconstruction right up to desegregation, understanding of what Black children needed, how they should be taught. And that's what we learn when we take Horace Tate's education, right? And bring it back to that.
And given these stories that you tell in your book about the strength of Black schools, the professionalism of these Black educators, how do we end up with this contemporary narrative that exists around Jim Crow era schools? Why do we have this story that these were failing schools that needed to be stopped?
We really do still have that narrative. There are a number of reasons for it. One reason is that it is true that the resources were poor. I mean, not until the 1950s in response to Brown, right? We don't want to implement Brown. So before Brown, we've been basically implementing Dred Scott, right? So they have no rights we have to respect. Under Plessy, we implement Dred Scott. When Brown comes, we implement Plessy, right? So we try to make the schools equal. So at that point, the narrative around inequality, the schools were unequal in the facilities, the buses, right? The transportation, the textbooks, and all of those ways. So part of the narrative is because those pieces were true. And it's not until we're trying to actually implement Plessy in the 1950s that we start to get some equality in facilities. The difficulty, of course, is that the historical narrative did not interrogate what was beneath the story of school boards not giving the facilities and the resources that were necessary. We didn't interrogate that. And because we didn't interrogate that, we missed the resilience of the communities. We assumed that because the school board said, you can't be anything, you shouldn't be anything, that's actually what they became. And so that's not true. So part of it, one of the reasons we missed it is because part of the story is true, right? The fact that for many of those years, there was inequality. The other part about it is what was done to Black history. The truth of the matter is that the records were destroyed. I knew this when I was writing Their Highest Potential. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't find the school records. Not only not at the school, what's left of it, but not at the State Department. I mean, where are the records? And as a professor sending out doc students, I later learned that it's everywhere, right? You can't, it was difficult to find, to locate the records. In some cases, the actual head of the Black Teachers Association in North Carolina said, I went back to my own office the day after we merged with the white teacher organization, and my own records were being destroyed. He was trying to contact Dr. Tate to get Dr. Tate's records so he could write his own story. So this massive destruction of the records of Black schools basically allows people to write any kind of narrative they want, right? Because historians rely on records. Part of why we don't know is because of the quiet collaborations. There was cooperative endeavor going on between the educators and the NAACP, the educators and other organizations as well. And in that cooperation, the NAACP needs the educators in the South, particularly in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. We need the plaintiffs, we need the money, we need the part that the Black educators can play, because the NAACP chapters in the earlier years could not be strong in the South. But the educators had the network that the NAACP didn't. And so the NAACP needs the Black educators' networks, and the Black educators need what the NAACP can provide, right? In advocacy. So you've got this quiet collaboration going on, this cooperative endeavor. And they all knew in the earlier years the roles that different ones were playing. And we want the NAACP to look in charge, because we want white people, right, to think the NAACP is doing it all. We can't let people think that it's these local teachers, right? Because they'll lose their jobs. So part of it is because of these veiled collaborations. Part of it is we looked in the wrong places. When we write the narrative of schools and Black teachers were afraid and everything was bad and nothing good happened until the kids were rescued and put in white schools, we looked in the wrong places because we looked at the teachers as individuals. As individuals, of course, they were afraid of losing their jobs. But the power wasn't in the individual, it was in the organization, right? So there's that. And I think the last piece, one that I actually have experienced, and that was very frightening when I was a young scholar and beginning to write about the resilience of Black communities in segregation. I think there's a fear. I think earlier on, the idea of saying that anything good could have happened in these schools, in pedagogy, advocacy, curriculum, care, anything. If you said that there was anything good about it, the fear was that it would be used to disrupt the desegregation agenda. So I had many scholars, senior scholars even. It was very challenging when I was the junior scholar. Behave in ways. If I asked questions at that time about, well, when the kids are desegregated, what does it look like within the school? They took that as a threat. A threat to the desegregation agenda. And we have to understand that the desegregation agenda is one that must incorporate both sides, that kids have to be in the schools, and we also have to think about who's teaching them and what happens within the schools. I'm sorry I took so long.
You please don't apologize. It's wonderful. Thank you. Elizabeth, in Mothers of you describe white women as the constant garden of white supremacy. They petition state or local levels, but they were mothers, they were churchgoers, they were teachers, sometimes even newspaper columnists. How did white women communicate ideas around white superiority in their families and communities? Can we, hold on one second. I'm having a hard time hearing Elizabeth. Can others hear her?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, now that's great.
So I think for white women that are the grassroots workers, and frankly, they're on the ground trying to prevent what Vanessa talked about, right? That they are working in these sort of local communities, and they're savvy local political activists. I think when we often think about activists, we hope that they're activists for a more equitable and just society, but the segregationists that I wrote about are white women who are activists for a society built around the ideas of white supremacy. But they knew that it took work at sort of all levels of society to craft a system, right, that that didn't make sense sort of intellectually, right, that they knew. Well, let me back up. So where do they work? They work in public and social welfare offices beginning in the 1920s to uphold white over black. They work in public education, which I'll talk more about in a minute. They establish political networks and organizations that are both local and regional, and by the 1940s, national, right, that uphold various iterations of white supremacist politics. And they participate in sort of the cultural work of Jim Crow storytelling, right, of disseminating stories to the larger public that reinforce this notion of white supremacy. But the very fact that white women have to work so hard at this, and in so many places, right, suggests the real, that their work is being contested. But in the 1920s, institutionally, they have a lot of the levers of power, right? The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the Supreme Court that had issued Plessy, the federal and state legislation, right, does not challenge this sort of notion of racial segregation that had been articulated in Plessy versus Ferguson and then had been acted out through laws and violence for decades before that. And so white women understand that if white supremacy is going to be upheld, that they're going to have to make sure that their local communities follow the rules. And the rules of white supremacy are that you maintain racial distance, that you ensure that your children get, if your white children get an education, a Jim Crow education, a civic education that upholds the privileges of whiteness and diminishes the opportunity of Black and brown families and children. That you make sure, if you're going to have a segregated society, that midwives and nurses have to mark birth certificates about the racial identity of the babies that they're delivering, and you have to erase the long history of Black, white, and Native families, right, that had been created out of coerced and violent relationships and some consensual relationships. And so I think on the ground, white women perform this sort of daily work, right? I don't know if Andrew has the images, but in Virginia, they pass a Racial Integrity Act in 1924, right? The state legislature says that a white person has no trace whatsoever of any blood of any other race, except for those that had tried to establish their connection to Pocahontas. If you were 1/16th American Indian, you could still be white. But this law wouldn't have worked if midwives and registrars in the counties hadn't upheld it. And so you can see, this is the front of the card, that after the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which was kind of the one-drop rule, which comes later in the United States than most people think, right? The 20s is the real proliferation of sort of reestablishing definitions of racial identity. And then you have to affirm, and if you can see on this slide, it says that if you make a false statement as to color, that you can serve 1 year in a penitentiary. So there were midwives that did not follow this, right? That did not follow this law, but they didn't follow it with the threat that they could, and particularly Black midwives that refused to sort of designate race, because that came with all sorts of other restrictions in their communities. And so the law wouldn't have mattered if people in communities did not uphold it. And so that's one way that white women who perform this kind of public egg money work, right? They get paid for having people fill out a registrar card. They get paid for turning this into the courthouse, sort of upheld racial segregation. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about what they do in education. And I think this has really long-lasting effects. So in the 19 teens and 20s, white women, as sort of former Confederates die out, right? White women who are producing this kind of white supremacist rhetoric focus on the public schools because they know that that's where this education has to be reproduced. That if they don't reproduce ideas of white supremacy generation after generation, right? If they don't draw the color line and prevent people from marrying and loving and having families, that their system, right, that secures their power is going to erode. And so they focus on public education, on segregated public education. And they focus on the textbooks, and they want to make sure that African American history is erased. And it is erased. If you'd picked up some textbooks in the 1890s, even produced by national publishing houses, you would have had the story of the Fort Pillow Massacre, where African American soldiers were shot by Nathan Bedford Forrest troops as they surrendered. But that is erased in the 1920s. And the way that these women activists do this is they begin to push Southern states. This is kind of wonky, but I'll be quick. They push Southern states to centralize textbook selection. And when the Southern states who lead the nation in doing this centralized textbook selection, then these women's organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others then lobby the textbook committees to choose particular textbooks. And then the publishing houses, which are national, respond because they know they can get a state contract. And they begin to produce history that follows what the United Daughters of the Confederacy want the next generations of Americans to learn, that slavery was a civilizing school, right? That minimizes the racist violence that took away the rights and political careers of Black activists in the South that had been gained during Reconstruction. In 1938 or 1939, the Mississippi Educational Association did a study of textbooks and found that and this is not just true of Mississippi, but that if you had gone to school and read every word in every textbook from kindergarten to senior year, that you would have never met a single African American by name, not one. And this is a result of white segregationist women trying to shape curriculum and trying to shape the nation's textbooks in a way that upholds white supremacy. They had essay contests in the 20s and in the 30s, and even in the 1950s after Brown, across the South, there were essay contests about why social separation of the races is natural. And so in 1959, you could write an essay and win $500 about why you think segregation is the way to go. That sent you to 4 years at a state university. And so I think there's all these ways that white women work in places that national legislation is not concerned about, right? That they make sure in their communities that the subsequent generations of white children are trained in the ideas of white supremacy. Stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Vanessa, in your book, one section I looked at, you're looking at 1966, so more than a decade after the Brown ruling. At that point, fewer than 0.5% of Black teachers in the South, fewer than 0.5% of Black teachers in the South were working in desegregated schools. 83% of Black children were still in segregated schools. Black principals were being displaced left and right. Black teachers were being eliminated altogether or given lower salaries than white peers. How did this happen? How was it that segregation was maintained post-Brown? And those are just some stats from a decade after, but I mean, we can, to the extent question as it relates to, the period beyond 1966 as well. How has segregation been maintained?
Well, let me talk about it in the 1960s. And I want to really commend Elizabeth for the really powerful work that she's done. Because if we look at what Black educators are doing in the period post-Brown and prior to its full implementation, typically 1969 or 70 in the South, the biggest fight is on the playing field that Elizabeth has established. That's the biggest place. It's the local policies. So Brown is a national Supreme Court case. Brown 2 is designed to make sure the South is not too unhappy with the Brown case. It is in the local arena that whites are able to mobilize. And Black educators understand that the mobilization is not to the advantage of Black children. You see them actually right after Brown celebrating, right? They're talking to the students about, oh, we know you're going to be ready for this, right? We've been preparing you. But then in the years that follow, they get quiet because they see how school boards are finding new ways to make sure teachers don't get the salary they deserve. Or even within building these new schools, right, for Black children, so we can keep them in their Black schools, but that people cut corners. So we might build the building, but then we make sure we don't give you the budget to be able to stock the school. So the local school boards, as far as Black educators are concerned, they don't know what Elizabeth's moms are up to. The local school boards are implementing the policies, right, that fire the teachers or decrease the salaries or get rid of the principals. And the Black educators are very clear that a large part of the fight is at the local level. But here's their hope. The hope is the federal government and the national organizations. So while in the local space, we know that the intent was to use federal money for white children, the new money that's coming in, and to integrate in ways that will preserve white privilege. They know that. But they think that on the federal level, they can get some support. Because on the federal level, initially with the Department of Education, I learned from Elizabeth's work that the white women don't want, but initially in the Department of Education after the Civil Rights Act, you have a Harold Howe, who's actually one of my former professors, although I didn't know him in that way at that time. But Doc Howe had one sin. He was actually trying to figure out how to get the federal government to implement integration in a way that was fair. And you see integrating teachers and principals, curriculum, a full integration. And you see him coming south. I now see him in his papers coming south, trying to convince local white school boards, superintendents, et cetera, that this is the right thing to do, right? This is America. We're supposed to integrate in a way that's fair. And so you see, initially, they think that the federal government is going to be behind their vision for integration. And Black educators want integration. They're the ones who've been behind it. They found the plaintiffs, right? They provided the money. They want integration, but they want a fair integration. And they think the federal government is going to back them up. And so you see them appealing to Harold Howe and others in the mid-60s because they still have this hope, right, that the federal government is going to make sure we do this right. And they are appealing to NEA, the National Education Association, which has passed a resolution about integration. And, they think that NEA is going to force the local white school boards to do what's right. But it doesn't work that way, right? Where the locals have managed to handicap Black education after Brown into the 60s, but the Black organizations are hoping that they'll be able to counter it through federal support and national NEA support. In effect, what really happens is you get a kind of school desegregation compromise, I call it, by 1968. And now not only do they not have the things that they were supposedly going to be given in the early 60s. But you now have, on the federal level, an effort to figure out how to create a desegregation that will work for local Southern white people. And so where Harold Howe had pushed for full integration, suddenly the language changes. By 1970, HEW is saying, oh, you know, we can't make all these local systems do what's right. Nixon is now president. You see the federal government step away. We are going to have an integration that preserves the language of integration. But we are going to not have actual integration. We are going within the language of integration, create systems and structures in the South that preserve white privilege. And so the federal government steps away from its earlier commitment to full integration. And NEA, although it does work with the NAACP to try to help keep Black teachers, basically NEA has a problem. It's not going to go to Southern school systems and fight a local battle because it needs to keep its membership. I mean, it's that simple, okay? And so while NEA requires mergers of Black and white teachers associations, it will not reprove its Southern white members. And it's Southern white members who are themselves hurting the Southern Black members. And this is why you get Horace Tate talking about, and other Black educators. What we've got going on here is a second-class integration. He said, you know, I worked for integration, he says. I worked for integration my entire life, did everything I could to eradicate inequality. But in choosing to accept integration, we cannot accept a second-class integration, he said, because the second-class integration is evil. They are forcing us, they're taking away all the pillars, and they're forcing us to believe that a language of equality can substitute for actual inequality. He called it tokenism.
It's such a rich history. I mean, Elizabeth, I'm thinking about how your book explains the careful strategy that went into preserving segregation from the interwar period through the 1970s. I think many Americans, especially white people, see racial imbalance in today's schools as simply how things are and totally unrelated to purposeful subordination or any kind of malice on the part of white parents. How do you explain this? How did we get from a time when white Southerners spoke openly about their belief in white superiority and move to a national conversation that justifies segregated schools with race-neutral talk about good schools, choice, and simply wanting the best for one's child?
Right. And I don't mean this glib at all, but this is exactly what white segregationists wanted white Americans to think. Right, the producers of this sort of white supremacist educational politics want, right, as the civil rights movement moves into the 60s, they want white Americans to consume ideas about racial integration that do create second class. It's not an accident, right? They know that they've lost with Brown and with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, that they've lost this sort of national legislative battle on the surface. And so, but they've maintained, and white women experimented with a colorblind language in the early 1950s and late 1940s, right? How do the producers of segregation create kind of a national network that we see limit the possibilities of integration that Vanessa was just talking about? It's because they begin to sort of build national coalitions with discussions about property values and parental rights. And as a parent in the 1950s, shouldn't I be able to choose if my child is going to be taught a curriculum that our local school system has developed or that the United Nations has now sort of spent UNESCO has spent years working on sort of the value of multiculturalism, right? Rather than say, well, I'm a white supremacist and I want a locally controlled curriculum, they say, right, that the United Nations communist and that they're worried that multiculturalism impinges on the sort of rights that they have as a parent to educate their children. And so I think by the time we get to the late 60s and the 1970s, they've had decades to work on this language in a way that allows the consumers of this kind of segregationist, white supremacist rhetoric to maintain kind of a racial innocence that, you know, that I'm going to buy a house in this neighborhood because the schools are good, and sort of tearing that apart from FHA policies that had denied housing loans to Black veterans after World War II, to the larger sort of municipal politics that had created segregated neighborhoods and created unequal schools. I mean, I think it's not an accident. Like, segregationists were not, I think we're harmed, right, by imagining that sort of white supremacists and segregationists, and I don't mean to say that these folks aren't powerful, but are sort of gun-toting, tobacco-chewing, kind of uneducated white men, or then like kind of demagogic political elected leaders. And we really need to shift and look at who's doing the work and begin to be able to see that segregationists can also be like, you know, a suburban soccer mom in a minivan, right? That's like the way we've sort of shaped who's a racist and who isn't, or who's a segregationist and who isn't, has really, I think, limited our ability to see this work. So just to fast forward in Boston, right, when Boston sort of came apart at the seams over the busing in the 70s. And a lot of white Bostonians would say, no, we're not like those white Southerners, right? We never made anybody sit at the back of the bus, right? We didn't do this, we didn't do that. But Black Bostonians are chanting, it's not the bus, it's us, right? Like the outcome of this anti-busing protest is that we'll be left in schools that aren't technically segregated, but are sort of second-class integrated schools with less resources. And so I think the way that this sort of colorblind narrative, the stories that we've told about the movement, and Vanessa's work speaks to this, the stories that we haven't heard have allowed this sort of innocence to be perpetuated, right? Like, I didn't choose this school because I'm a white supremacist, right? I chose this school because this is where, like, they have really good test scores, or their students have, 60% of their students go to college, or, the ways, and we've pulled that apart from the policies that were not race neutral, that created the conditions that allowed that to happen. And so we've missed Vanessa's stories. We've missed the stories, we focused on the George Wallaces, and we haven't focused on the fact that that segregationists didn't just quit in 1964 or 1970 or 1965 or 1972, that they'd been working on strategies to combat, professional Black teachers who in North Carolina at the time of the Brown decision were better educated. More African-American women had master's degrees that were teaching in the public schools than white women, right? And so they would have been paid more if they had kept their and so I think that it is not, but by not telling those stories and say, oh, the civil rights movement was successful, and I'm not saying it wasn't successful, but it was successful because we don't have white and colored signs anymore. Well, yes, but we also have other signs, right, that aren't so obvious, and other markers that have allowed the second-class integration to sort of proceed.
Thank you. In just a moment, we're going to open up an opportunity for you to put those of you who are with us, for you to ask a question of of Vanessa and Elizabeth. Okay, so if if we don't already have questions, now's your time to start thinking about what you want to ask. And you can leave a comment on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching, tweet it using the hashtag that Gina offered you earlier. But since I still have a moment, because we don't have any yet, I'm gonna get another question in. And I would love to put this to you, Vanessa. I think so much about what your book teaches us about all that was lost for Black communities as a result of what Tate called this second-class integration. And I wonder if, drawing on your research, how you might answer a parent who asks, what's the point of integration given the effect on children's psyche and intellectual development, given that hasn't always been positive, and given that we've lost so many educators, is this something we should still be working towards? Supporting independent Black-led schools. On what you've learned through these histories, how would you respond to that question?
It's a fair question. But before I answer it, I want to say something that links to something Elizabeth said, because I think it's important. Elizabeth was talking about the ways in which integration was disrupted. I could actually pull out a speech, literally the audio of Dr. Tate speaking in 1970, saying almost verbatim exactly what we heard Elizabeth saying. These Black educators talk about up South, and its context is important because they said when they couldn't figure out what was going to happen with integration in the South, they just looked to what the North had done because the North had integrated 100 years earlier, right? And the strategies were the same, and they talk about up South being exactly the same as what we see in the actual South. This context is important because the problems are everywhere. And Elizabeth is absolutely right. The problems were set up, and Black educators are calling and naming these problems between 68 and 70. They don't see the source. They don't know it's the white mothers. They direct towards school boards, but they see the evidence of the problem. And so should we just give up? Well, here's the problem. You have to understand what Black educators were looking for in integration. And I think of it as 3 A's. For them, integration was going to be an additive model. They were going to have everything they had under segregation, and they were going to get what they did not have under segregation. So let's think about, in their additive model, what did they already have? They understood how to do schools under oppressive circumstances, without full facilities, without all the textbooks, all of these things. They figured out how to build resilient Black children. Martin Luther King is a created being, a result of the curriculum. Thurgood Marshall, all of these people who were smart enough to tear the system down come out of these schools. So they figured out pedagogically how to create these climates that prepare children to work and live in a very negative, larger context. They've got down aspiration. That's the first A. They know how to create schools that help children to aspire to achieve, notwithstanding what else the rest of America is doing. They figured out a second A, how to advocate. That's what's going on in their organizations. That's what Lost Ed is about, right? That's when they're able to advocate and press against these negative systems. I would argue that in every domain where white women are trying to figure out another strategy, one of the reasons they have to keep trying to figure it out and continuing it is because through these organizations, they're figuring out ways to chop against the inequality. So they figured out advocacy. If their formula for integration was additive, then what do they want? And here's the third A, access. They imagined schools that would give them access to facilities, other colleges of education, all these things that they had been denied. They would have full access, and they would still have caring school climates, and they would have people to advocate when things went wrong. This is the context for what you call real integration, right, with the National Coalition. But Black educators are behind that case in 1968 in Virginia, right? The Green case. So the factors that define real integration actually come out of the Black educators' playbook for what real integration should look like. You see it as early as the Brown decision, where they have a wide variety of this is what it should look like. Okay? What happened is that instead of getting an additive formula, we get an exchange formula. We're going to give you pretend access in exchange for giving up your teachers and your principals in these powerful networks. So we're going to get rid of these Black teacher organizations. NEA made sure that happened through the merger. And we're going to turn our backs on the dismissal of Black teachers and Black principals. These are the people who know how to create these schools that can allow children to be resilient. So instead of getting aspiration and advocacy and access, we get half of access, and we lose our school climates that create aspiration, and we lose our advocacy. Should we just go back? I hear more Black people ask me that question than I really care to tell, because people are frustrated and they are angry at what they see. But here is the problem. There is nothing to go back to. You don't have anywhere evidence of equality in segregation. We tried that in Boston 100 years earlier. You see the flip-flop between should we have caring school climates or should we have equality in facilities and resources? And you see the parents flipping back and forth trying to figure out which, and every time they pick one, then the elements against them would amplify the inequality in the other domain. So there's no evidence that we can make it happen the way it was. We don't have the ways in which those teachers were trained. We don't have schools of ed who are training in that way. We don't have the networks that we had. We don't have the strong connections with parents that we had. So the system that was created was fully dismantled in 1970. And frankly, I've not seen anything that comes anywhere close to the interconnections that they had across the South, across the country, even across the world. So if we go back, we've got to figure out what back is and how to put those things in place. So that's the problem. I think the better strategy is to go back to what they intended with real integration. They had a plan, an inclusive guide to school integration. They wrote in Georgia as they died. Okay? I want to say personally, I lived what they originally envisioned. It can work if we decide to do so. When I came out of UNC Chapel Hill in 1980, I cannot believe 40 years ago, with all due respect to my professors, I did not learn how to teach in Chapel Hill. I learned because I had a Black mother who had been part of this system. And in ways I now know that I could never have articulated, I was one of those teachers I would 20 years later decide to write about. I didn't know these things then. It's only now as I look back at it. Our principal was one of the 3 Black principals who survived school desegregation as a high school principal in North Carolina. I heard the teachers say that. It did not mean anything to me at the time. It meant nothing. But as I have later come back and overlaid my experiences as a teacher in North Carolina with what I have written about, I see in operation at Cummings High School in Burlington, North Carolina, under a Black principal, a Black leader who carried all the elements of these other Black leaders, and who I now know was mentored by the principal I wrote about in Their Highest Potential. I knew none of this at the time. Here's the point. We had an extraordinary, desegregated school. Extraordinary in test scores, extraordinary in the care ethic, in curriculum, and the high standards, and making sure We had a multicultural curriculum. It was an extraordinary school. When he left and a white woman became the principal, it changed. The last time I went to look at it, I'm ashamed to call the name because I don't want people to go look it up. The last time I went to that school to visit out of nostalgia, it looks like any other urban school with all the issues and problems. Now, what made the difference? What made the difference was a person with a vision for what real integration looks like. He was leading a school that was black and white, and everybody had to fall in line with the way in which he thought about what good schooling should look like. So should we just go back? I'm not sure. It's leadership. And our black principals here in Georgia said they fired us first because they knew we were the key to everything. Now, when he told me that,
reading your book, I wondered about that document that you mentioned that GT and EA produced. Can we just revive that document because it lays out so much of what you've just mentioned in terms of what could actually create real integration, not this second-class integration that we have today. I want to make sure I think we have some questions from the audience that I want to put to you too. So Casey asks, given that you're historians, what do you see that's different about this moment? Hearing that Dr. McRae is saying the same thing Tate said sounds like a little progress. So what, if anything, do you see that's different about this moment? Do you want to speak to that, Elizabeth? I'm having a hard time hearing you. Are you unmuted?
I think I'm having a little hard time what the question is after. Like, in the moment now, have we progressed? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think that's it. Like, what's different about this moment? I mean, another way you could think about that, Elizabeth, is like, is there anything from the research that you've done that can help us, reimagine what schools should look like today?
Well, I think Vanessa offered a really good model of what a reimagined school of today could look like. I don't want to be negative, but I think we've also on the edge today of another 50 years of really lobbying against public education. That the sort of forces arrayed against public education really coalesced after the Brown decision and rose out with the new right. And so I guess my hopeful part is that if we understand at the national, state, and local level what is preventing us from achieving schools that offer real integration and real equity and real opportunity, that then we know where to sort of fight, right? And wherever our strengths are, we can begin to, and our access is, whether it's local or state or national, that we can begin to sort of chip away at the policies and the politics that have really solidified kind of a second-class integration. And I do think there are schools out there that offer models for possibilities, and we should look to those.
Yes, go ahead, Vanessa.
I started
please
kind of jumping around like a little kid. I want to answer both from my work in history and also from my experience as a parent, having raised a child in a desegregated school that was supposed to be a very good school, and she has been very successful. But I've seen it. I've seen your parents, Elizabeth, on the PTA. Because I'm one of the few Black people that, I guess they deemed, able to be a part of the inner circle because I lived in the right neighborhood and I could speak and string, as Jesse Jackson would say, put a few words together, subjects and verbs, and make them shake hands. And So I looked like just a browner version of them. And I heard, so the person who asked the question about where are we today, I can say that it appears to me, impressionistically as a parent, that your mothers are as active as they have always been. I have seen that in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And I won't bore everybody with all the details, but I have countless stories of what I have observed, which is why your work was so powerful for me. I certainly read contemporary work about how middle class white mothers co opt schools. I was familiar with that work, but I did not know the history of it until I read your work. I have seen that structure at work today, privileging white children in particular kinds of ways and minimizing other people's children, to use Lisa Delpit's terminology. The fact that Dr. Tate could foresee what would happen and that I would live it. It took me 18 years to write that book because it took so long to find all the strands of what they were doing. It was so different from the histories I had read and had been told. And so I have memories of leaving him and hearing him talk just as you talk, and then drive to my daughter's desegregated school to pick her up. And now I'm in the reality of something very different. I'm not encouraged because he foresaw where we are. That doesn't encourage me at all. I am discouraged. And I'm discouraged because I do not see the interconnected advocacy that is necessary to counter what's happening today in schools. We need the kind of interconnected advocacy that existed from Reconstruction right up to desegregation in order to counter it. They didn't counter it fully, but they have successes that we can point to in each generation. And I'm concerned. We've got to figure out how through the National Coalition and others to connect people in ways that better model what Dr. Tate and his colleagues and peers were able to do. Because right now, I don't see where these mothers have the accountability. There's no organization like the Black organization that holds them accountable. And I think because they have swayed federal policies in the directions that we have gone, the federal government is not accountable except in language. So I feel actually that's not based all on my history. Some of that is impressionistic based on my time in the schools. But I do think the time is now to reconnect a lot of the pieces that were lost.
Let's get to this one question, this colorblind rhetoric. This is from PMK 180. Colorblind rhetoric is obviously still extremely powerful in modern society. How can we push back against this and develop a new discourse that recognizes the realities of race in America? If we can be somewhat brief in our response, that would be great.
I think historically speaking, as the women, and I think Ibram X. Kendi's formulation is really helpful. The producers of segregationist and white supremacist rhetoric decided early on to shift away from overtly racist language to things like women for constitutional government, right? Which sounds pretty innocuous. So I think one way is to look when people evoke the things that are seemingly race neutral, that we have to look to the policies rather than rhetoric. We have to go to sort of what policies and are being passed. And that should be our bellwether, not the kind of language that's being used, right? Because we're like we're way into this colorblind rhetoric and it's extremely powerful. And so I think that we have to sort of go beyond, I think we have to go behind the rhetoric, frankly.
I think two things. One is that we need a real knowledge of our history and an agreement on an agenda. I'm not convinced that we're fully agreed on the agenda. I think there are, just like Dani, you write about, Black teachers aren't always the solution because they've been taught in schools, right? So they've bought into the kind of tokenism framework, and they don't always know what they don't know. Not all of them, but some of them. And so I think a knowledge of our history, what we lost, what we're trying to gain, what real integration looks like, and an agreement on that agenda is one thing that we need to do for people who bought into privilege. And it's not all white women who bought into what privilege means. And I think we have to acknowledge that. The other thing is that we're going to need a variety of strategies. I mentioned the need to be interconnected with our advocacy, and that's one of them. But there are a variety of strategies that Black educators use under oppressive circumstances, and they didn't tell everybody what they were. And out of respect for them, I don't actually plan to tell everybody what they all are either. But it's more than one. There are strategies, and we need to pull those back.
Those who know don't say.
Sometimes you don't tweet all your strategies because then people know how you're doing. And these people who didn't just have oppression of language, race-neutral language, they had actual oppression. Educators were getting lynched. I've been in the lynching files in the NAACP. They had real oppression, lose your job, house, etc. And they figured out how to maneuver. You're telling me we cannot, with their history as a tool and a coordinated agenda, we can't figure out how to reappropriate some of those strategies nowadays? I think we can. But that conversation is best held in the boardroom in private.
I think there are also natural alliances. There's a lot. The poverty crosses some lines that also, and I think class and race have to be sort of attacked together in public education.
Well, this has been enlightening. Thank you both for digging into these stories and sharing them with us and being willing to be in conversation with me and with each other. I want to go ahead and hand things over to Andrew Lefkowits, Integrated Schools. Andrew, take it away.
Thank you, Dani. All right. Get out your tissues, everybody. I'm Andrew. I'm a white dad from Denver. If you've ever listened to the Integrated Schools podcast, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, that's what he looks like? If you haven't ever listened to the Integrated Schools podcast, you're probably thinking, who is this guy and why on earth does he get to talk after those incredible women? Believe me, I am asking myself the same question. The only answer I can give you is that I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to ride on the coattails of the late, great Courtney Everts McKitten. On October 30th, 2018, Courtney and I launched the Integrated Schools podcast in an effort to broaden the reach of the organization that Courtney had started back in 2015. We had 3 episodes, a boatload of trepidation, and we emailed the small at the time but mighty Integrated Schools community, posted on Facebook and Twitter, and put into the world deeply personal conversations, the kind of conversations that Courtney was so good at. Honest, funny, leaving space for growth but not excuses. Conversations that heard you where you were but weren't afraid to pull you further along. Over the next year and 2 months, she and I produced 38 episodes. The learning curve was steep. We missed deadlines because we had no idea how much work any of this might be. We ended up with some incredible conversations with just terrible audio quality. My apologies to the great David Kirkland. We learned new technology. And by that, I guess I mostly mean that Courtney tried to learn new technology and I tried not to lose my patience. And we constantly questioned and re-questioned the content. It was scary to put these conversations out into the world. Conversations about race, about segregation, about parenting. There are so many places to step wrong, and we knew that we'd make plenty of mistakes along the way. But we worked really hard to share conversations that were brave, that were thoughtful, and that might play some small role in changing the narrative in white and or privileged communities about school. Somehow it struck a nerve. We celebrated when we hit 300 downloads and then 500 downloads and then 1,000 and then 10,000. We were touched and amazed and humbled by the emails from people saying, this is what I needed to hear. You know, I thought I was the only one who thought these things. And while neither of us ever expected the podcast to reach quite so many people, somewhere deep down, Courtney knew that if people could hear the stories, it might make a difference. She believed deeply in the power of stories, in the work that the stories we tell ourselves do in how culture is built. A year ago tomorrow, as part of a series we did on Brown v. Board at 65, we released an episode called I Hope They Hear It in Our Voices. It was a conversation with Carol and Greg, two Black parents who had opted into a mostly white, quote, good school. They were choosing to be a part of a form of desegregation, but they shared the ways that racism and white supremacy infected nearly every interaction they had at school. It was uncomfortable, and while in some ways it undermined some of the arguments for that type of desegregation, Courtney knew that we needed to hear their stories. We needed to see Greg and Carol in their full humanity and to grapple with the truth of their experience. Not only, as Vanessa's work so clearly shows, was desegregation hard, but desegregation is still hard. But, Courtney's vision wasn't about trying to tell some surface level version of desegregation. She wasn't trying to sell white people about what they could get or what they could do for others. It wasn't all about opportunity hoarding or white saviorism. The goal wasn't to dupe white people into sending their kids to schools with mostly Black and brown student bodies. She knew that the impact of our arrival was so often problematic and that we had a lot of work to do to ensure that we weren't causing harm. Despite having started an organization that was committed to integration, called Integrated Schools, she knew that we couldn't gloss over the real costs of desegregation, both then and now. She knew that an inadequate or worse, an inaccurate version of the story of desegregation, a story that ignored those costs, that pretended that somehow Brown v. Board solved racism in schools, was never going to get us to a deeper, more meaningful understanding. It was never going to help us know better so that we could then do better. Around episode 5, she started to close every episode with that Maya Angelou shout out saying, "We're grateful to be in this with you as we try to know better and do better." Well, Courtney knew you could never do things right. There was no way to be a perfect white person, a 10-step plan to being a perfect integrating parent. She did believe that you could and should do better, but that the only way to do better is to know better. And she also believed that if enough white and or privileged parents started actually doing better, that we wouldn't be talking about small scale changes, tweaks around the edges of the education system. Her vision was a fundamentally different way for white and or privileged people to interact with our educational system. Not to try to create a program that might nudge the needle on graduation rates or boost standardized test scores, but because she believed deeply in the promise of public schools and their foundational role in our democracy. And she knew that our kids, if they can find shared humanity with other kids who don't look like them, that maybe they'll do better than us. Not in early literacy or on the SATs, but at forming a true multiracial democracy. On December 30th last year, she was struck by a car while, unsurprisingly, having a conversation with her neighbor, standing on the sidewalk across the street from her house. And while the hole left from her loss seems to grow daily, especially in the midst of this crisis, her vision and her commitment and her love of conversations goes on. We've released 8 more podcasts. Our Facebook group has grown. We've heard from people all over the world about the impact that Courtney had on their lives. Many of them never even met her. Maybe we're fortunate enough to have a phone conversation with her. About a month ago, we hit 100,000 downloads of the podcast. A truly bittersweet moment that shows that Courtney's vision lives on, that there's still great power in stories, and that the work of anti-racist school integration is more important now than ever. Not because it might lead to better distribution of resources, though it almost certainly will. Not because it might boost academic achievement for all kids, though, again, that's likely. And not because by shoving different kids into the same building, our work as a society in building a multiracial democracy is somehow done. I think the reasons that the work is still important are strewn across our news feeds every day. The work is important because the kids who are in school today are tomorrow's teachers and doctors and police officers and fathers and sons just keeping an eye on the neighborhood. Stories like those that Vanessa and Elizabeth tell in their work, and this conversation today, so beautifully facilitated by Dani, it's what fed Courtney's soul. And I think it's in leaning into the challenges that they present and finding each other's humanity through the conversation that we can find hope, that we can imagine the type of world we want for our children. Courtney's coattails were a hell of a ride. Being part of this event feels somehow unreal, but it leaves me more committed than ever to telling stories, sharing conversations, and continuing to try to know better and do better. So with that, I'd like to bring back Gina.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. Sorry, I threw up a slide. I'll fix that. No, I'm not as good as Andrew is on the technology, so I'm gonna let him handle that. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. We will have this available online afterwards if you missed parts of it or would like to share it with folks. But I just am so grateful to everyone who worked on this episode, and I know Vanessa's just returning from vacation, so I owe her big time for that. I did want to let you know at least about one event that's coming up on the 18th that's being hosted by Integrate NYC if you want to stay plugged in. And then I think Andrew also has some information about the book club, but go ahead and put it out.
Yeah, Integrated Schools, part of having these conversations and continuing to build a community of parents and other people committed to these ideas is a book club. It's actually how I first got to meet Courtney and get connected with Integrated Schools a couple of years back. And the next one is coming up in June. We're going to be reading Raising White Kids by the great Dr. Jennifer Harvey. So check out the website, integratedschools.org, and find out more about that.
And then on our end, Integrate NYC, along with a few of our partner orgs, including Teens Take Charge, is hosting an online discussion about school integration in New York City on the 18th between 6 and 8 p.m. Eastern. So I'll have that link available on our social media and online as well. I wanted to invite folks maybe to say a few last words if you want to. If not, we can sign off. Why don't we start with Courtney Martin?
Just want to, express a tremendous amount of gratitude for the bodies of work that Elizabeth and Vanessa bring as historians. I just think those of us who are trying to make contemporary, real anti-racist action are so dependent on, girding all of that action in history and in the complexity and nuances of history. So I'm just so deeply grateful to both of you for your work, and of course, Dani for her beautiful contemporary work with ushering that conversation. And Andrew, I love everything about the way you brought yourself to that and to Courtney, and you're such a beautiful tribute. And the way that you carry her legacy through your work now is so important. So I just say that. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
I want to thank everybody for, it's been an honor to participate in this and to read the work of Dani and Vanessa, which I hope I would have gotten to, but maybe not as quickly as I did. And the conversations. And Gina, I think sometimes I think you're like a Ouija board in my life, and that I met you and you were like, oh, you should read this book on reproductive justice. And then all of a sudden I hear from Loretta Ross, and then I meet Dani McClain. And so I'm really just looking forward to what this conversation, how it's going to loop back around. And I appreciate all the work, Courtney, Andrew, Vanessa, Dani, and Gina, that you all have done. And I hope that these conversations will change the world we live in.
Awesome. Dani, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'd like to make a just explicit ask for those of you who are watching to go to bookshop.org and order Elizabeth and Vanessa's books. I mean, they are They kept me up at night when I usually sink into my couch and watch television. I was like, oh, I don't care about HBO. Let me get into these like riveting histories. So please buy their books. And also, if you haven't already subscribed to the Integrated Schools podcast, do that as well, because those conversations, I've been listening to the archived conversations and they're incredible. And just a thank you to this group. This has been a real joy during this time of stay-at-home orders. I've actually found real community just in being in conversation with you all, and that means a lot. Thank you.
Vanessa?
I've learned a lot, all of which I plan to incorporate in my teaching in the fall. I've learned a lot from all of you. But I think I want to end by saying that I'm the reason you have to do the work with you. Because I am the child who was in the segregated schools. I started out in segregated schools. And who was integrated and who succeeded. I went to institutions I would not otherwise have been able to go to, and who was pivoted forward in SES in a way I would not have had. So I write about what the schools need to be, because I think in my generation, when the doors opened, we were already mentored. We just fell through them and we succeeded. We've got to figure out how to make the children behind us have the same opportunities that my generation did. So if the work gets hard, I just want to remind you of my face, right? I'm the reason, and others of my generation, for why you, for why we, for why all of us have to do the work. If we don't do the work, we need to quit talking about America and its vision and its promise. If we do the work, maybe we can write now another history, right? That'll be written for people to read in another 100 years about how we turned this thing around. So it's been my honor to be with every one of you, to meet new friends, and I can't wait until we can meet together in person, and then we can hug.
All right, Andrew, anything else?
No, I couldn't possibly top that.
All right. Take care, everyone, and we will try. Well, we'll see you as soon as we can when it's safe.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.